The fire cracked like a gunshot in the cold New Mexico night, and Louise Rourke felt the heat of it on her face before she felt anything else. Before the terror, before the grief, before the truth about Stephen Walden that had just been delivered to her by a man with a crooked smile and a folded letter that she still held in her trembling hands. She had read the words 3 times, 4 times, and still they refused to make sense in the way that devastating things rarely do when they first arrive. "He was never going to marry you," Cole Draper had said, his voice carrying that particular cruelty that only small men with big information can muster. "The ranch, the land, the deal with your father, it was all to get the deed to the southern pasture. He never wanted you, Miss Rourke, just your land." And then Cole Draper had ridden off into the dark, leaving her standing alone outside the bunkhouse with a letter that supposedly bore Stephen Walden's signature and a confession of exactly that intent, and the fire burning in the stone pit just ahead of her, and the whole wide sky pressing down on her like a millstone. She sat down on the wooden bench beside the fire because her legs would not hold her anymore. That was where Stephen found her, not 10 minutes later. He came out of the main house with his hat in his hand, and he stopped when he saw her face and the letter in her lap, and he did not say a single word. He just looked at her for a long moment, and then he walked to the other side of the fire, and he pulled his chair, a heavy oak thing with a cracked left armrest, and without ceremony, without announcement, without explanation, he moved it across the dirt and set it beside hers, and he sat down. Not across the fire, beside her. The silence between them stretched and hummed like a telegraph wire, and Louise, who had prepared every bitter word she intended to fire at him, found that she could not speak either. That was how it ended. Or rather, that was how something entirely new and terrifying began. She had arrived in Cimarron, New Mexico territory in the autumn of 1878, and if anyone had told her then that she would spend a night in October of 1879 sitting beside a fire with a man she was not sure whether to trust or to love, she would have told them they were out of their minds. Louise Rourke had come west because she had no other choice. That was the honest version, the one she never said aloud. The version she told people was that she was a woman of independent spirit who wished to build something of her own in a land that still had room for building. And there was truth in that version, too. But the more complete truth was that Boston had become impossible. Her father, Gerald Rourke, had been a land speculator of modest success and spectacular debt. When he died of a fever in the spring of 1878, he left Louise 2 things: a surveyed parcel of land in the New Mexico territory that he had never once visited, and a letter to a rancher named Walden explaining that his daughter was coming to take possession of it, and could the rancher please extend her every professional courtesy as a neighbor. Louise was 24 years old. She had grown up in a household that was perpetually on the edge of financial ruin, but maintained the careful appearances of respectability. She knew how to keep books, how to manage a household staff, how to press a dress. She did not know how to ride, how to brand cattle, how to read weather, or how to manage the particular species of hard men who populated the frontier. She arrived in Cimarron on a Thursday in late September of 1878, on a stage that smelled of leather and tobacco and the particular misery of long travel. She had 1 trunk, $32, a surveyor's map of her land, and her father's letter. The town of Cimarron sat in the shadow of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and in the autumn it was golden in a way that Louise had not expected and could not quite name. The cottonwood trees along the river turned a yellow so bright it looked manufactured. The air was thin and clean and slightly cold. The sky was enormous, a fact she had read about but not truly understood until she stepped down from the stage and looked up and felt briefly vertiginous. The station agent told her that the Walden Ranch was 4 miles east of town, and that a man named Hector from the Walden outfit usually came into town on Thursday mornings for supplies, and if she waited, she could probably get a ride. She waited. Hector turned out to be a short, deeply weathered man of about 50, with a quick smile, and a mule-drawn wagon loaded with flour sacks, and he spoke more Spanish than English but communicated with comfortable efficiency. He loaded her trunk onto the wagon without being asked, and gestured for her to climb up beside him with a kind of natural gallantry that she found immediately reassuring. The 4 miles to the Walden ranch passed in a landscape she found alternately beautiful and alarming. The terrain was not like anything she had seen. The land rolled and broke in unexpected ways, studded with juniper and pinon pine, cut through by dry arroyos, overlooked by mesas that stood like sentinels against the pale sky. It was spectacular and inhospitable and enormous, and she loved it and feared it simultaneously. The Walden ranch house came into view around a long bend in the dirt road, and Louise's first impression was that it was larger and more substantial than she had expected. It was a proper adobe structure, long and low, with a covered porch along the front and a kitchen addition jutting from the back. There were corrals to the east, a barn with a gambrel roof, a bunkhouse, a smokehouse, and a stone well. It was a working ranch, clearly prosperous, clearly the product of sustained effort. Stephen Walden was standing in the yard when the wagon pulled up. Louise had not known what to expect, and so she had conjured an image in her mind during the long journey that was vague and composite, assembled from things she had read about Western ranchers. Some version of an older, weather-beaten man of practical competence and few social graces. Stephen Walden did not match that image. He was 31 years old, though she would not learn this until later. He was tall, with the kind of build that came from genuine physical labor rather than deliberate cultivation, broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else. He had dark hair worn slightly long for propriety but not long enough to draw comment, and a face that was deeply tanned by sun and wind, angular and still and arranged into an expression of watchful reserve that was not unfriendly, but was not immediately welcoming either. He wore work clothes, canvas trousers, a dark flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow despite the cool of the afternoon, boots that had seen considerable use. No gun visible, though she would learn he wore one when he rode. He looked at the wagon and then at her and he said, "Miss Rourke." Not a question. He had been expecting her then. "Mr. Walden," she said, and climbed down from the wagon before Hector could assist her, because she had decided on the long ride out that she would begin as she meant to continue, which was independently. He watched her descend without comment, and then he walked to the wagon and helped Hector with the trunk, and carried it himself to the porch without waiting for instruction or discussion, and that was the first impression she kept, that he was a man who assessed situations and simply acted, without the kind of performative deliberation that men of her father's class had used as a form of status display. He showed her to a room that had clearly been prepared with some care. There was a braided rug on the floor, a quilt on the bed, a small washstand with a pitcher and basin, and a window that looked east toward the mountains. "Supper's at 6, he said. "My cook, Maria, runs the kitchen. You're welcome to whatever you need." And then he left her to unpack, and she stood in the middle of the room and looked at the mountains through the window and tried to organize her thoughts into something manageable. Over the first weeks, she began to learn the shape of her situation. The land her father had left her was the southern pasture, a stretch of roughly 400 acres that butted up against the Walden Ranch's western boundary. It had water on it, a reliable spring-fed creek that Stephen's cattle used seasonally, and grass that was better than average for the territory. It was, she came to understand, enormously valuable to Stephen Walden. She also came to understand, gradually, and through the frank conversation of Maria, who had no patience for circumspection, that there were other men in the area who wanted that land. One, in particular. Cole Draper was the owner of the Draper outfit, a larger operation to the south that had been in conflict with the Walden Ranch over grazing rights for several years. He was 43, twice widowed, and known in the county for a combination of financial cunning and personal ruthlessness that had made him many enemies and no close friends. "He will come to see you," Maria told Louise one morning in the kitchen, rolling tortillas with the practiced speed of long habit. "He will be very polite, very generous. He will want to buy your land. And should I sell?" Maria's expression conveyed everything she needed to convey without words. Cole Draper did come to see her, exactly as predicted, on a bright October morning 3 weeks after her arrival. He arrived on a handsome bay horse, wearing a good coat and a pleasant smile, and he sat in the parlor and drank coffee and spoke to Louise with the kind of careful charm that she recognized immediately as a professional tool rather than a natural disposition. He offered her $800 for the southern pasture. It was a significant sum. It was also, she strongly suspected, about half what the land was actually worth. She told him she would think about it. He smiled with his mouth and not his eyes and said that was perfectly reasonable and that he hoped she would come to see the wisdom of the transaction. And then he rode away, and Louise sat in the parlor for a long time after, looking at the mountains. Stephen said nothing about Draper's visit that evening, but she saw that he knew about it, from the particular quality of his stillness at supper and the careful way he did not bring it up. She found this restraint interesting rather than frustrating. He was not a man who pushed himself into other people's decisions. It was this quality, she would later understand, that had misled everyone who tried to read him, including herself. The first time they had a genuine conversation was entirely by accident. She had gone to the stable in the early morning, before anyone else was moving, because she could not sleep and she wanted to see the horses, which were beautiful, a fact that even her inexperience could appreciate. Stephen was already there, working on a piece of harness by the light of a lantern, and he looked up when she came in and then looked back down at his work without making her feel that she had intruded. She watched him work for a few minutes, and then she said, "What are you repairing?" He showed her without the condescension that she had come to expect from men explaining things to women. He simply showed her the cracked stitching and the worn leather, and explained in plain language what had failed and how he was fixing it. And then, because she asked a follow-up question, he explained something else, and then something else. They talked in the stable for nearly an hour. It was not a romantic conversation in any obvious way. It was a practical conversation about horses and harness and leather working, and the particular demands that high-altitude desert terrain placed on equipment. But it was the first conversation she had ever had in which she felt that the person speaking to her was also genuinely interested in what she thought, and not just waiting for her to finish so he could speak again. She walked back to the house in the cold morning light feeling something she could not immediately name. It took her several days to identify it as the sense of being seen. November in Cimarron arrived with a cold that surprised her even though she had been told to expect it. The mountains collected snow first, and then the snow moved down into the valley in stages, and the world changed from gold to white and gray, and the work of the ranch shifted accordingly. Louise had by this point established that she was not a guest but a working participant in the household, though her definition of working was still evolving. She had helped Maria with the kitchen. She was a competent cook, better than she had let on in Boston, where cooking had been something servants did. She had begun to learn to ride under the patient tutelage of a cowhand named Ben Torres, who had the gift of teaching without making the student feel foolish. She had begun, cautiously, to understand the business of the ranch, and she had begun to spend more time with Stephen Walden, not in any way that anyone could have pointed to and named. It was gradual and quiet, and had the character of something that was happening naturally rather than something either of them was directing. They talked in the evenings when the day's work was done, sometimes in the parlor by the cast-iron stove, sometimes on the porch if the evening was not too cold. He told her about the ranch's history. He had built it himself over 9 years, starting with nothing but a land claim and money borrowed from a banker who had since died and probably gone to hell, as Stephen put it with the dry, understated humor that she had come to love. She told him about Boston, about her father, about the particular brand of genteel poverty that spent its energy on maintaining appearances rather than addressing realities. She had never talked about this to anyone. The words came out of her in the quiet of those evening conversations with an ease that frightened her slightly, because she was not accustomed to feeling safe enough to be honest. By December, she knew she was in serious danger of falling in love with him. She managed this knowledge the way she managed most frightening things, which was by examining it very carefully and not allowing herself to do anything impulsive about it. He had given her no indication, she told herself. He was kind and attentive, but he was kind and attentive in general. He was the same way with Hector and Ben and old Maria. That was simply his character. What she did not know, and could not have known from the evidence available to her, was what he was thinking. Cole Draper returned in December with a higher offer, $1,200 now. Louise thanked him and said she was still considering her options, and Draper smiled his non-smile and said he hoped she understood that the offer had a practical time limit, as he had other arrangements to make. After he left, Stephen came to find her in the kitchen, where she was helping Maria make pies for the Christmas celebration she had learned the ranch held annually for all the hands and their families. "You don't have to decide anything because of Draper's pressure," he said. She looked up from the pastry she was cutting. "I know. The land is worth more than he's offering. I know that too." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I'd like to make you an offer of my own if you're willing to hear it." She set down the pastry cutter and turned to face him properly. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, and the afternoon light was behind him, and she noted with some detachment that he was very difficult to look at directly for extended periods. "Go ahead," she said. "A partnership," he said. "The Southern pasture folded into the Walden operation. You'd hold a share, a genuine share, not a nominal one, equal water rights. A proper deed arrangement drawn up by a lawyer in Santa Fe. You'd be a co-owner of record." She studied him. "Why?" "Because the land is strategically important to this ranch," he said plainly. "Because Draper will make trouble if he gets it. Because you clearly have no intention of running cattle yourself, at least not yet, but you also have no intention of being driven out." "That last part is certainly true," she said. "And because I would rather share the land fairly with you than have you be pressured into selling it to someone who will use it as a weapon against both of us," he said. It was a practical argument. It was entirely sensible. It made obvious business logic. And yet she had the feeling, which she pressed firmly back down, that there might be something else underneath it. "I'll think about it," she said. He nodded, as if this was exactly the answer he expected, and went back to whatever he had been doing. Christmas on the Walden Ranch was a revelation. The bunkhouse was decorated with pine boughs and candles. Maria cooked for 3 days straight, producing quantities of food that seemed physically improbable. The hands came with their families, women and children, transforming the usually masculine landscape of the ranch into something warmer and louder and infinitely more human. There was music, a fiddler named Aurelio who could play anything from a reel to a waltz, and who played with the concentrated joy of a man doing the thing he was born for. There was dancing in the cleared space of the barn. There was whiskey for the men and cider for everyone else, and laughter, and the kind of communal warmth that Louise had not experienced since she was a child. She danced 3 times, twice with Ben Torres, who was a patient if unenthusiastic partner, and once with Stephen, who turned out to be a significantly better dancer than she would have predicted. He held her correctly, at the proper distance, one hand at her waist and one holding hers, and he led with the quiet authority that characterized everything he did. And she was grateful for the noise and movement around them because it gave her somewhere to look other than directly at his face. When the dance ended, he walked her to the side of the barn and said, "You're a good dancer." "You sound surprised," she said. "I am a little," he admitted, and the honesty of it made her laugh, and he smiled, actually smiled, not the careful, contained expression he usually wore. And the smile changed his face entirely, opened it somehow, and she felt the ground shift slightly under her feet in a way that had nothing to do with the dance. She accepted his partnership offer in January of 1879, and a lawyer named Hartwell came up from Santa Fe in February and drew up the papers, and it was done. The southern pasture belonged to them both, in equal legal measure. Cole Draper's response was not immediate, but it was eventual, and when it came, it was cold and deliberate. He began a campaign of small disruptions. Walden cattle found with cut fences on the south boundary. A Walden hand named Perkins was beaten badly on the road between the ranch and town one evening, badly enough that his right hand was never quite right again, though no one could prove who had done it. A rumor circulated in Cimarron that Stephen Walden had obtained the partnership agreement through improper pressure on Louise Rourke, a helpless widow from the East who did not understand what she had signed. This last rumor reached Louise's ears through Maria, who delivered it with the precision of someone depositing a lit explosive. Louise went to town the next day and had a conversation with 3 separate people she had identified as nodes of Cimarron's social information network, and she corrected the record clearly and without anger, which she felt was more effective than anger in this context. She was not a helpless widow. She was not a widow at all. She fully understood every word of the partnership agreement, and she had found the arrangement entirely to her advantage. And if anyone wished to discuss the matter further, they were welcome to speak with the lawyer in Santa Fe whose name was on the document. The rumor did not entirely die, but it changed character. Now the version circulating was that Louise Rourke was an unusually capable woman from the East, which was arguably more useful to her. Stephen heard about this through his own channels and said nothing about it directly, but the next evening at supper, he looked at her across the table with an expression she was beginning to be able to read, which was the one that meant he was impressed but would not say so. She was beginning to be able to read him generally, which was not a skill that many people had acquired. He communicated in ways that required attention and patience, in the angle of his body, in the careful selection of words, in what he chose not to say. It was, she had come to understand, not reserve in the sense of coldness, but reserve in the sense of a man who had learned that words cost something and should be spent with care. Spring came to the New Mexico territory slowly, like a cautious guest, testing the air before committing to arrival. The snow retreated from the lower elevations and then from the higher ones, and the grass came up green and improbably vivid, and the creek in the southern pasture ran full and cold with snowmelt. Louise rode with Stephen in April to check the water situation on the southern pasture, the first real riding she had done beyond the immediate vicinity of the ranch. Ben Torres had taught her enough that she could manage competently, and the horse she rode was a reliable sorrel mare named Penny who had no interest in drama. The southern pasture in spring was extraordinary. The creek wound through it with the particular music of moving water over smooth stone, and the grass grew thick and green right to its banks, and there were cottonwoods along it that were just coming into leaf, that new leaf green that is the most purely optimistic color in the natural world. She pulled up Penny on a rise above the creek and looked at it, and she felt something expand in her chest that was not quite happiness and not quite pride, and was something she did not have a word for the specific sensation of caring about a place, of having it matter. "It's beautiful," she said. Stephen pulled up beside her. He looked at the pasture and then at her and then back at the pasture. "Yes," he said. It was only one word, but the quality of it suggested that he was not only talking about the land. She looked at him, and he was already looking away toward the horizon, his jaw set, his profile clean against the sky, and she thought, "I am so thoroughly in love with this man that it is becoming practically inconvenient." She did not say this. Instead, she said, "The creek bank on the north side has some erosion. We should look at it." "Yes," he said again, and they rode down to look at the erosion, and the moment passed, and neither of them acknowledged it, and both of them held it carefully. The complications arrived, as they always do, without announcement. In June, Stephen's sister arrived. Her name was Stephen Walden, and she was 34 years old, and she lived in Denver, and she arrived on the stage from Santa Fe with 2 large trunks and an agenda that she made no particular effort to conceal. Catherine was a formidable woman in the way that certain people are formidable, through the specific combination of sharp intelligence and complete willingness to use it as an instrument. She was not unkind. She was frank, which people sometimes confused with unkindness, but was in fact merely uncomfortable. She assessed Louise in about 30 seconds with the accuracy of a surveyor, and she said, the first evening when they were alone in the parlor, "You're in love with my brother." Louise did not insult her by denying it. "I'm not certain what your point is," she said. "My point," Catherine said, settling into the armchair with the comfort of a woman who was used to making herself at home anywhere, "is that he is equally in love with you and has no idea what to do about it, which is consistent with his character and would be charming if it weren't also potentially idiotic. That's a remarkably frank assessment. I am a remarkably frank person. I have no husband and no children, and I have chosen this deliberately, which means I have more time for frankness than most women. Now, let me tell you something useful about Stephen." Louise waited. "He lost someone," Catherine said, "years ago, a woman he was engaged to in Kansas before he came west. She married someone else when he couldn't afford the life she wanted. It was not a violent tragedy, no one died, but it was the kind of loss that teaches a person to be careful. He has been careful ever since, too careful in my view. Why are you telling me this?" "Because you deserve to know the shape of the obstacle," Catherine said simply. It changed something in Louise's understanding, though she could not have said precisely what. It did not change her feelings, which were by this point sufficiently entrenched to be essentially geological in their permanence. But it changed her comprehension of the silences, the careful reserve, the way he always stopped just short of what she suspected he wanted to say. He was afraid of being wrong about her. He was afraid of reaching and finding nothing there. And so he moved slowly, incrementally, with the caution of a man who had learned that hope was expensive. She understood this because she was operating on exactly the same principle from the opposite direction. In July, Cole Draper made his actual move, and it was worse than Louise had expected. He had spent the spring and early summer acquiring, through a complex series of transactions that Louise only reconstructed afterward, nearly all the land surrounding the southern pasture. Not the pasture itself, but everything around it. And now he filed a claim with the county land office asserting that the southern pasture's water rights were subordinate to his holdings, and that the creek's water, under territorial law, belonged to his range. The legal argument was thin. Hartwell, the Santa Fe lawyer, said so plainly when he came up to review the situation. But thin legal arguments in 1879 in the New Mexico Territory did not automatically fail, because the territory's legal infrastructure was still largely improvised, and the judges who served it were of variable quality. What Cole Draper had, more importantly, was a local judge named Cresswell who was known to find Draper's positions persuasive with a regularity that was difficult to explain by judicial merit alone. Hartwell laid out the situation at the kitchen table in July, and his assessment was not entirely hopeful. "If Cresswell hears this, you may lose the water rights. Without the water, the southern pasture is worthless for grazing. And without the pasture serving its intended function, the partnership structure becomes much harder to maintain." Stephen sat across the table from Louise, and he was very still, and she could see him thinking. "What do we need?" he said. "Documentation," Hartwell said. "Evidence that the creek has historically served the Rourke parcel and the Walden range together. Survey records, any prior agreements about water usage, testimony from people who have knowledge of the land going back far enough." "I can get testimony from the men who have worked this range for years," Stephen said. "Better than that," Louise said slowly. "My father's original survey documents. They would have included water sources." She looked at Hartwell. They were filed in Boston with the Land Office records from the speculators consortium he was part of. If those records show the creek as an appurtenant water source to the parcel, that predates anything Draper is claiming. Hartwell looked at her with new attention. That would be significant. Can you obtain those records? I can write to Boston immediately, she said. Stephen looked at her across the table, and she saw in his face a quality she had not seen there before, which was something close to awe, quickly contained. Louise wrote to Boston that evening. The letter took 3 weeks to make the journey, and then they waited. Cole Draper, meanwhile, came to visit. It was mid-July, and he arrived in the afternoon, and he was pleasant in the way that a snake is pleasant when it is resting, and he sat in the parlor with Stephen and Louise and Hartwell and said that he had no wish for this to become adversarial, and that he had a proposal. His proposal was that Louise sell him her half of the southern pasture at a fair price. He named $1,800 now, a considerable jump from his earlier offers, and that Stephen retain the grazing rights but surrender the water claim, and that the whole matter be settled without recourse to litigation. Louise let him finish. Then she said, "No." Draper looked at her with the particular blankness of a man who is not accustomed to direct refusal from women. "Miss Rourke, I think you may not fully appreciate." "I appreciate it completely," she said. "You've spent the spring encircling us with purchased land, you've filed a water claim you know to be legally questionable, and you're counting on Judge Cresswell to give you what the law won't clearly support. This is a trap, Mr. Draper, and I think you know I know it, so let's not waste each other's time pretending otherwise." The room was very quiet. Draper looked at Stephen. "You've clearly found yourself a spirited partner," he said. "I have," Stephen said, and the simplicity of it, the absence of apology or qualification, was the most clearly personal thing she had ever heard him say about them. Draper left without resolution, and they all understood that the legal matter would proceed to court. The records from Boston arrived in August. They arrived in a package that had been forwarded from the original Land Speculation Consortium's archive by a clerk who had included a note saying he hoped they were useful. They were more than useful. They were decisive. The original survey of Louise's parcel, conducted in 1871, described the creek explicitly as the primary water source for the parcel, granted as part of the land itself under territorial statute. The water rights were appurtenant. They were not subordinate to anything. They predated Draper's holdings by 7 years. Hartwell held the documents in both hands and looked at them with the expression of a man who has been handed something he was afraid would not exist. "This is exactly what we needed," he said. "Is it enough to beat Cresswell?" Stephen asked. "It's enough to make the case. The question is whether we can get a venue that gives us an honest hearing." Hartwell was quiet for a moment. "There are federal land cases going through the circuit court in Santa Fe. If we can get this characterized as a federal land matter rather than a purely local one, we're out of Cresswell's jurisdiction. Can we do that?" "There's an argument to be made," Hartwell said. "It will take time." It took 2 months. In the end, the case was heard in October 1879 in Santa Fe, before a federal circuit judge named Morales, who read the original survey documents and the territorial water statutes, and took about 3 hours to render a decision in favor of the Walden-Rourke partnership, affirming the appurtenant water rights in full. Cole Draper lost. The news reached Cimarron by telegraph and then by stage, and by the time Stephen and Louise rode back from town having heard it, the afternoon was turning copper and the sky over the mountains was doing the spectacular things it did in October when the light was low. Stephen said on the ride back, "You saved the ranch." She looked at him. "We saved the ranch." He looked at her for a moment, and then away, and said nothing else, and they rode the rest of the way in the particular silence that was not empty but full. That was the evening that Cole Draper sent Cole Draper's man. His name was Rowley, and he arrived at the ranch at dusk with the letter that he gave to Louise and not to Stephen, with the specific intelligence that Draper's man had apparently been watching, and knew that Louise had ridden back separately from Stephen, who had stopped at the stable while she walked to the bunkhouse area. The letter was not a legal document. It was a personal letter, and it was addressed to her alone, and it said things that she had not expected. It said that her father, Gerald Rourke, had approached Cole Draper in 1876, not 1878, with an offer to sell the southern pasture before he had even filed his land claim properly. That there was a prior agreement between them, unwritten but witnessed, that Louise had inherited a legal encumbrance she did not know about. That the partnership with Walden was built on a foundation that Draper could collapse at any time with the right witnesses. And then there was the other part. The part that said that Stephen Walden had known about this prior agreement when he proposed the partnership, and that he had entered the arrangement knowing the legal risk, knowing that Louise would bear the cost of it if it went wrong, because what he had actually wanted all along was not her land or her company, but simply the delayed time for his own lawyer to find a way to claim the water rights independently, using the partnership as cover. The rancher never wanted you, the letter said. He wanted the legal leverage your land provided. You were a tool in his dispute with me, Miss Rourke, a convenient one. The letter was signed by Draper, and beneath his signature were two names, witnesses to the supposed prior agreement between her father and Draper. Louise sat down beside the fire in the stone pit outside the bunkhouse, and she read the letter 4 times, and she felt herself fracturing in a way that was extremely precise and extremely cold, like glass that has been struck in exactly the right place. She had won the legal case. But if this letter was true, she had won it for a man who had used her as a pawn. And she had fallen in love with that man. And that made the betrayal not merely strategic but personal, in the most total and devastating sense she could imagine. Cole Draper's man, Rowley, had delivered his piece of information with visible satisfaction, and then he had ridden away, and she was alone with the letter and the fire and the dark. When Stephen came around the corner of the bunkhouse and found her there, she did not look up. She heard him stop. She heard the silence, and then she heard the sound of a chair being dragged across the dirt, his oak chair, heavy and deliberate, and then she heard him sit down beside her, not across the fire, not at a distance, beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cold of the night. She held the letter out to him. He took it. She watched him read it in the firelight. His face was very still, and then it changed in a way she had not seen before, and the change was not guilt, which she had been braced for. The change was something more like controlled anger, moving across his features like a storm across flat land. He looked up from the letter and he looked at her, and she looked back at him, and the fire was between them now in the metaphorical sense that matters. "I never spoke to your father," he said. "The letter says otherwise." "The letter is a forgery," he said. "Or at minimum, a fabrication. Louise." He said her name for the first time, just her name without the formal address, and the shape of it in his voice was a thing she felt physically. "Look at me." She looked at him. His eyes were dark in the firelight, and she had learned to read him over the past year, and she read him now. No evasion, no performance, no calculation. Just the unguarded face of a man who needed her to believe him and knew he could not compel her to, and was holding that knowledge with everything he had. "I entered the partnership because the land mattered to the ranch," he said. "I have never deceived you about that. But I entered it, I proposed it, because I could not think of another legitimate reason to keep you here. Because the idea of you selling to Draper and leaving," he stopped. He looked at the fire. He looked back at her. "The partnership was the best legal mechanism I could construct for making you stay, and I am fully aware of how that sounds." Louise was quiet for a long time. "You wanted me to stay," she said. "Yes. And instead of saying that, you proposed a land partnership." "Yes." She looked at him. "Stephen, that is the most complicated way anyone has ever told me they wanted me to remain in their life." Something shifted in his face, something between relief and the terrified awareness that relief might be premature. "The letter," he said. "The witnesses' Draper names, I know them both. One of them, Jim Carver, is a Draper hand. He would sign anything Draper put in front of him. The other, a man named Sells, died in March. He cannot be examined or cross-examined, which is convenient. You can prove this. I can prove Carver works for Draper. I can prove Sells is dead, which anyone can verify. As for the supposed agreement with your father, there are no records because it did not happen. Hartwell can file papers with the county in the morning if you want the formal refutation. And the informal one, she said quietly. He turned to face her fully, and in the firelight he was entirely unguarded, which she understood cost him something. Understood it cost him significantly, because he was a man who had learned not to be unguarded. "I have been in love with you," he said, "since approximately February of this year when you rode out in the snow to argue with Ben Torres about the correct methodology for teaching someone to turn a horse. You were completely wrong about the methodology, incidentally." She stared at him. "February. The snow," he confirmed. "You have been carrying this since February." "I'm a slow-moving man," he said. She looked at the fire and then at the mountains invisible in the dark and then at him. "I have been in love with you since Christmas," she said, "when you danced with me, which means I have been carrying this longer." He was quiet and then he said, "Longer is not a competition." "No," she agreed. "It isn't." The fire cracked and settled, sending a small spray of sparks into the cold air, and they both watched it, and the silence between them was entirely different now. Not the silence of things unresolved, but the silence of things that had finally reached the place they were always going. He reached out and took her hand, not urgently, not dramatically, simply and with the quiet certainty of a man who had decided and was not going back from it. His hand was warm and rough and large, and she held it, and the night pressed in around them with its cold and its stars. "Draper's letter," she said eventually. "We'll handle it in the morning." "I know we will," she said. "I just want to make sure you know that I knew you didn't write it. Or rather, I almost believed it for about 10 minutes. But then I thought about who you are, about everything this year has been, and I could not make the letter fit the man I know." He tightened his hand around hers just slightly and said nothing, and moved his chair infinitesimally closer, which was physically impossible since they were already as close as the chairs permitted, but the gesture was what mattered. "I would like to court you properly," he said after another long silence, "if you're willing." "We've been partners for 9 months," she said. "That was business." "A great deal of it didn't feel like business." "No," he agreed, "but I would like to do it properly, with the understanding that the intended direction is permanent." Louise Rourke looked at Stephen Walden across the firelight, this man who had shown her the shape of a life she had not known she was capable of wanting, who had moved his chair closer to hers in the cold and the dark, when all the easy things would have been to stay on the other side of the fire, who had loved her since February and kept it with the same careful, enormous patience with which he kept everything that mattered to him. "Yes," she said. He nodded once, as if this was the conclusion of a very long and important piece of work, and held her hand, and they sat together until the fire burned low. The next morning, Hartwell rode out from town with remarkable speed when he received Stephen's note, and by afternoon the legal refutation of Draper's letter was in process. Carver's employment by Draper was easily documented. Ranch pay records were not private documents, and his name appeared on Draper's quarterly supply accounts at the Cimarron Mercantile, which referenced his role as a hand. Sells's death was certified by the county record of death, which existed because the doctor who had attended him was meticulous. The supposed prior agreement between Gerald Rourke and Cole Draper crumbled without its witnesses. Hartwell filed a formal complaint for the fabrication of legal evidence, and the circuit judge in Santa Fe, who had just spent 3 hours ruling against Draper in a water rights case, was not inclined to be lenient about it. Draper did not go to prison. The territory's legal machinery was not fine-grained enough in 1879 for that outcome to be reliable, but he paid a significant fine, lost his standing to file further claims against the Walden-Rourke partnership, and found himself publicly identified as a man who fabricated evidence, which in the community of Cimarron had consequences that were perhaps more lasting than any legal sanction. His influence in the county declined sharply and continued to decline through the following year. Stephen Walden, who had returned to Denver in August and received news of all of this by letter, sent a reply of approximately 1 page, the final line of which read, "I see that patience is occasionally rewarded. About time." Stephen read it once, folded it precisely, and put it in his desk drawer. The courtship, as Stephen had described it, was, given the circumstances, somewhat compressed from conventional timelines. This was partly because they had in fact been building something across an entire year that simply needed the formal acknowledgement to become complete. It was also because life on the frontier did not accommodate the kind of extended formal courtship that Boston drawing rooms had been designed to host. What it looked like in practice was that he rode with her every Sunday morning on the southern pasture, that he began to say, directly and without camouflage, what he thought and felt about things, as if the February to October of containing it had used up his capacity for containment. That he looked at her in a way that he had always looked at her but no longer looked away when she caught it. That one evening in November, he kissed her for the first time in the stable, completely unpremeditated, when she had been laughing at something he said, and he had simply, as he would later describe it, run out of reasons not to. The kiss was neither long nor theatrical, and it was followed by a silence of approximately 15 seconds, during which she could hear the horses breathing and the wind outside and her own heartbeat. And then he said, "I should have done that in February," and she laughed again, and the horses shifted at the sound. He asked her to marry him in December, standing in the kitchen while Maria was very conspicuously out of the room, and he did it in the direct and unornamented way he did everything, which was to say he looked at her and said, "Louise, I would like to marry you. I love you, and I want the rest of my life to be organized around that fact. Will you?" She said yes without making him wait, because he had waited long enough. Maria came back into the kitchen almost immediately, which strongly suggested she had been listening from the passage, and she hugged Louise and then shook Stephen's hand with a formality that was somehow more moving than either gesture alone. They were married in February of 1880, exactly 1 year after Stephen had apparently decided he was in love with her over the question of how to teach someone to turn a horse. The ceremony was held in the Cimarron Church, performed by a Methodist minister who had come to the territory from Ohio, and who had the good sense to make the ceremony substantive without making it long. Catherine came from Denver. Ben Torres, who had taught Louise to ride, stood up with Stephen as his oldest hand and friend. Maria sat in the front row in a dress she had been working on for 3 months and wept beautifully from beginning to end. The day was cold and blue, and the mountains had snow on them all the way down to the lower ridges, and the light when they came out of the church was that specific winter light that turns everything to crystal. Louise Rourke Walden stood on the steps of that church and looked at the mountains and at the man beside her, and at the town that had become, in 16 months, more genuinely home to her than anywhere she had ever been, and she felt the things she had felt on the rise above the southern pasture in the spring, but larger now, much larger, large enough to fill the whole sky over it. They went back to the ranch, and Maria had organized a celebration that the entire population of the surrounding range seemed to have been invited to. And there was music again, Aurelio with his fiddle, and a man named Charlie who played the harmonica, and there was dancing in the barn, and Stephen danced with her twice, and the second time he held her closer than propriety technically recommended, and she did not correct this. Life on the Walden Ranch in the years that followed was not without difficulty, because the frontier was not a place where difficulty was optional. There were drought years when the grass browned by June and the water in the southern creek dropped to a thread, and they managed water with the care of people who understood what it cost. There were years when cattle prices dropped and the numbers were very tight, and they sat at the kitchen table in the evenings and went over the books together, which was something that Stephen had never done with anyone and which he found, to his surprise, significantly less painful when shared. There was a winter in 1881 that was so severe that they lost 40 head of cattle to cold and another 30 to a disease that the territory's veterinary resources were insufficient to address, and that winter tested the ranch in ways that were genuine and punishing. They weathered it together, which was the necessary condition. Their first child was born in the spring of 1881, a boy they named James, after no one in particular but simply because they both liked the sound of it. He arrived with the specific drama of first births everywhere, on a night when the midwife from town barely made it out before the road became impassable from spring mud, and Maria delivered him with a calm efficiency that saved Louise a great deal of additional anxiety. Stephen, for all his composure in every other circumstance, was not composed for the hours of James's arrival. Louise, in the intervals when she had attention to spare, found his visible terror both alarming and deeply endearing. When it was over and Maria put James red, astonishingly small, and already expressing strong opinions about his situation through the medium of volume, into his father's arms, Stephen's face did something she had never seen it do before, which was simply dissolve entirely into something unguarded and enormous and completely without words. He held his son for a long time and looked at him with the attention he gave to things that mattered, and then he looked at Louise, and she had never felt so loved in her life. Catherine came from Denver to meet her nephew and stayed for 3 weeks, holding James with practiced ease and declaring him excellent in a tone that suggested she had expected nothing less. James grew with the specific energetic determination of a child raised on a working ranch, developing an early and passionate interest in horses that seemed almost inevitable given his parentage, and a gift for observation and patience that his father recognized as familiar. Their second child arrived in 1883, a daughter they named Clara after Louise's mother, who had died when Louise was 12, and of whom she had spoken only occasionally but always with a particular quality of voice. Clara was from her first hour a different order of person than her brother, quieter, more interior, but with a precision of observation that her mother recognized immediately and with great fondness. By 1883, the Walden Ranch was one of the most stable operations in Colfax County. The southern pastures water had been a decisive advantage through 2 drought years when neighbors had struggled. Their reputation as careful managers and fair employers meant that good hands stayed, and the hands who stayed built a community on the ranch that had the character of something permanent and chosen. Cole Draper had sold his holdings and left the territory in 1882, destination unknown and largely uninvestigated. His absence was unremarkable to the community, which had found him unremarkable in most important ways once the legal embarrassment of 1879 had removed his influence. Louise had been running the ranch's books since 1880 and had expanded this into a broader management role that no one had formally assigned her, and which had evolved simply because she was good at it, and because Stephen, who understood that competence should not be ignored on grounds of convention, had recognized what she was doing and supported it without ceremony. She also ran a small correspondence school from the ranch for the children of the surrounding range families, something she had started informally in 1880 when it became clear that the nearest proper school was too far for regular attendance. By 1883, she had 12 children coming twice a week, and Maria, who had more education than anyone who looked only at her kitchen would have guessed, taught arithmetic and Spanish while Louise taught reading, writing, and the rudiments of geography. It was not the life she would have imagined in Boston, in any version of imagining she would have been capable of then. It was the life she had actually built, which was a different order of thing. One afternoon in the autumn of 1883, she was sitting on the porch doing the ranch accounts, and Stephen came and sat down beside her, not across from her, because that was simply not how he sat anymore, and he was quiet for a while, watching James chase Clara around the yard with the specific comedy of the age gap between 4 years and 2 years on full display. "I was thinking," he said. "About what?" "About the additional section to the north," he said. "Bradshaw is selling. His range butts up against ours. It would make sense to add it." "I know," she said. "I've been thinking about it too. The price he's asking is almost right. I think we could go 200 less." He looked at her. 200 less. He needs to sell before winter. He has less leverage than he thinks. Stephen was quiet for a moment with the expression that meant he was impressed but would not say so, which was different now from how it had been in 1879, because now she always said it for him. "You're right," she said. "I know." He made a sound that in another person might have been a laugh, and he reached over without looking away from the yard and put his hand over hers on the account book, and she turned her hand and held it. James caught Clara and immediately expressed regret about having done so, given the force of her opinion on the subject. The mountains to the east were doing the October thing with the light. The fire in the stone pit, they had rebuilt it that summer into a proper fire ring, was unlit at this hour but would be lit by evening. "I think we should talk to Bradshaw this week," she said. "Tomorrow," he said. "I'll ride over tomorrow morning." "We'll ride over," she said. "I want to see the northern water situation before we commit." "Of course," he said simply, without qualification, without negotiation, because in nearly 4 years of marriage they had arrived at a partnership that was as genuine and equal as the legal document they had signed in 1879 had intended, and that both of them had, in different ways, hoped for long before either of them could say it. They acquired the Bradshaw section at the price Louise had named, because she was right about Bradshaw's leverage. The additional range expanded their operation to something that was, by the standards of the territory, a significant ranch, and the additional grass and water made their position through the drought of 1885 considerably more stable than their neighbors. That year, 1885, they also hired a young woman named Alice as a school teacher. Louise had been running the correspondence school since 1880, but with Clara approaching school age and James needing more than she could give him in terms of advanced subjects, and with the ranch community having grown to the point where 18 children came for instruction, the situation had outpaced what she could manage alongside everything else. Alice was 23, the daughter of a minister from Taos, and she was one of those people who had a gift for teaching that was so natural as to be nearly invisible. The children simply learned in her presence, as if it were the obvious thing to do. The small schoolroom Louise had built adjacent to the main house became a real school, and Alice boarded at the ranch, and the community of children that moved through it daily became one of the things Louise was most proud of, in a quiet and foundational way. Maria, who had been the heart of the ranch kitchen since before Louise arrived, retired from full-time cooking in 1884 when her knees made the long days on her feet genuinely difficult. She did not leave. The idea of Maria leaving had no reality for anyone at the Walden Ranch. She moved into the smaller room adjoining the kitchen that had been built to her specification, and she cooked when she wanted to and supervised always, and told everyone what to do with the authority of a person who has built something over many years and has every right to the authority it confers. She also, in her semi-retired state, spent considerable time holding Clara and later the third child, who was a boy born in 1886 and named Thomas, because there had been a Thomas in Louise's mother's family who had done something useful once that Louise could not quite remember but felt it worth honoring. Thomas arrived with considerably less drama than James had, which Louise found unfair but Stephen said was probably because they were better at it now, and she told him that this was the most unhelpful observation she had ever heard a man make, and he held Thomas in the experienced way of a father of 3 and looked unmoved by the criticism and entirely besotted by the child. James at 5 was already interested in the cattle work with a seriousness that amused everyone except Stephen, who could see the shape of who his son was becoming and found it largely recognizable. Clara at 3 had decided that she was in charge of the household and was managing this conviction with remarkable effectiveness for someone who could not yet reach most of the furniture. Thomas was simply Thomas, round in content, and regarding the world with the benign curiosity of a person who has recently arrived and is finding it largely acceptable. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the ranch was settling into the nighttime quiet, Louise and Stephen sat by the fire in the stone ring. They had built it up now into a proper outdoor sitting area with 2 solid wooden chairs and a low table between them, and on the warmer evenings the whole household sometimes gathered there, but on the quiet evenings it was theirs. They sat close, because that was how they sat. From the beginning, from the night he had dragged his chair across the dirt in the dark, that had been the spatial truth of them. Close, beside each other, facing the same direction. She had thought on that night in October of 1879 that she might be losing everything. The land, the partnership, the year of careful building, the impossible tender thing she had been carrying since Christmas. She had sat beside the fire in the cold and held a letter that told her the cruelest possible version of events, and she had almost believed it. And then he had come around the corner and done the simplest possible thing. He had not argued, had not performed, had not constructed an elaborate defense. He had just moved his chair to where she was. She had understood, in the way that certain things are understood before they are known, what that movement meant. That a man who has spent his life keeping careful distance does not close it without reason. That the space between chairs is sometimes the space between people, and when someone moves across it without fanfare, without condition, without asking for anything in advance, it is its own kind of declaration. The most complete declaration in some ways, because it did not say, "I am here if things go well," or "I am here if you believe me," or "I am here contingent on the resolution of circumstances." It said simply, physically, with the weight of an oak chair on packed earth, "I am here." On a September evening in 1887, 9 years after she had stepped down from a stage in Cimarron with $32 and a surveyor's map, and no idea what was ahead of her, Louise sat in her chair by the fire and watched the last light leave the mountains. And James, 8 years old now, brown and earnest, brought her a cup of tea from the kitchen with the careful 2-handed gravity of someone conveying something important, and Clara trailed behind him demanding to know why she couldn't carry it. She was almost 6, and Thomas sat in the dirt near the fire making a pile of something with the purposeful contentment of a 3-year-old who has found sufficient occupation. Stephen came out of the main house and surveyed this landscape. His wife, his children, the fire, the mountains fading behind the darkening sky, and he walked across the yard and sat down in his chair, which was beside hers, because it was always beside hers. James delivered the tea and was praised and immediately wanted to know if he could stay up late, and the negotiation that followed was conducted by Louise with the efficiency of a woman who has successfully negotiated water rights, land acquisitions, and the terms of a legal partnership, and finds a bedtime argument comparatively straightforward. The children were eventually brought inside by Maria, who appeared in the doorway with the authority of someone who has been managing this household since before most of the people in it were born, and who communicated with a single look that the bedtime discussion was concluded. The yard was quiet. The fire burned. The mountains were dark shapes against a sky that was still holding, in the west, the last of the color, a deep reddish gold that faded slowly to purple to black as they watched. "Thomas made a pile," Stephen said. "He did," Louise agreed. "A very intentional pile. He's a lot like you." She looked at him. "How so?" "The intention," he said. "He decides what the pile is for before he starts making it. Clara makes piles and finds out after. James makes lists first." Louise considered this. "That's a very precise observation. I have been observing my family for some years," he said. She reached over and put her hand on the arm of his chair, and he turned his hand and held hers because that was also how they sat. "Ben Torres is talking about retiring," she said. "I know. I think he's earned it. I want to make sure he has something, a proper settlement. We can manage that." She paused. "Alice told me today that she may be leaving in the spring. There's a man she's been corresponding with in Albuquerque. A schoolteacher, apparently. Is she happy about it?" "Very." "Then it's good," he said simply. "We'll need to find someone else for the school." "We'll find someone. We always figure it out." He said this without bravado, as a statement of fact established by evidence. They always had figured it out. 9 years of evidence. The fire was burning lower, and the stars were coming out above the mountains with the particular intensity of high-altitude darkness, and the air was cold and clean and smelled of pine and wood smoke, and the particular smell of the New Mexico night that she had first encountered getting off a stage in 1878, and which she now associated with everything that mattered to her. "I was thinking," she said, "about the spring." "What about it?" "Whether we should look at the section to the south of Bradshaw's. The one that borders the creek further down. The water there is reliable," he said. "I know, I've been thinking about it too," she smiled. "Of course you have." "You get there first usually," he said. "I have an unfair advantage," she said. "I do the books." "Then maybe I should do the books." "You'd hate it." "Yes," he agreed. "I would hate it absolutely." She laughed, and he smiled at her sideways. The full smile that was still the one that changed his face entirely. The one she had first seen at Christmas in 1878, and that she would never fully get used to because some things you don't get used to. You just keep receiving them with the same startled gratitude. The fire settled with a soft sound, throwing a small spray of sparks, and the stars above them were extraordinary, the whole enormous inventory of them, flung across the dark with complete disregard for modesty. She looked at the fire, and at the mountains, and at the man beside her, and she thought about the woman who had gotten off a stage 9 years ago with $32 and a map and a quiet, deep terror that she had never admitted to anyone. That woman had been brave, she thought, though she would not have called it that at the time. She would have called it desperation. But there was a kind of courage in it all the same, in going toward the unknown because the known had become impossible, in trusting that something worth having was possible even when the evidence was not yet present. The evidence was present now. She had a ranch that was thriving, a partnership that was genuine and equal, 3 children who were becoming people she found endlessly interesting, a community of families around her that had the character of something built rather than assigned, a school that was teaching children who had little other access to learning, and a man beside her who had moved his chair across the dirt on a cold October night without being asked and without conditions, and had not moved it back. She leaned slightly toward him, just slightly, the same increment he had moved the chair that night, and he put his arm around her in the easy, unself-conscious way of a man who has done this for years and has never once taken it for granted. They sat together by the fire under the stars over the mountains in the New Mexico territory in 1887, and the night was cold, and the world was large, and they were, each of them, exactly where they were supposed to be, which is the rarest thing in the world and the best. From the house, faintly, came the sound of Clara telling Thomas something in the urgent tone of someone, informing a junior person of crucial information, and Thomas apparently found this compelling, judging by the sound of his response, and from the direction of the kitchen Maria's voice carried the particular calm authority that meant the children were in very good hands and the night could continue undisturbed. Stephen tightened his arm around her slightly, and she put her head against his shoulder, and the fire burned, and the stars burned, and the mountains stood in the dark as they always had and always would, and Louise Rourke Walden was home. Not the home you start with, not the home you're given, but the home you choose and build and fight for and sometimes almost lose, the home you earn through the long, patient work of showing up every day, the home that was always waiting at the end of the hardest year of her life, on the other side of a fire, in a chair that a man moved closer to hers without saying a single word. Because some things don't need words. Some things are said better in the movement of a chair across cold dirt, in the quiet that holds between two people who finally understand each other, in the warmth of a fire against the dark, in the choice to sit beside someone instead of across from them, and to stay.